Hello, I'm Rabbi Elton from the Great Synagogue in Sydney, and welcome to From the Rabbi's Bookshelves. This is the second in our three-part series on the works of Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Berkovits. Last week we looked at his approach to Jewish theology in general and the very foundations of the Jewish religion, and now we're going to look at his approach to Jewish law through this book, Not in Heaven. Not in Heaven is a quotation from a Talmudic story which tells a dispute about whether an oven was pure or impure. And on each side, the different rabbis lay very compelling arguments, but the majority goes with one particular rabbi. The other rabbi, very infuriated by this, calls out to God himself to intervene, and a heavenly voice cries out that the law is according to this particular rabbi. And then the rabbi who's won the majority of his colleagues says, no, the Torah is not in heaven. That's a verse in the book of Deuteronomy, and he quotes it to say, we don't take any notice of heavenly voices. The Torah has been given from God to humanity, from God to the Jewish people, and now we work it out ourselves. Berkovits uses this quotation as really the manifesto at the centre of his work, which is that it is for human beings, for the Jewish people and their rabbinic leaders to work out what the law should be. We don't look to some pristine and perfect and separate interpretation of the law that might come from heaven. Rather, we work out what is necessary in this world and we implement it accordingly. Now, in his previous work, God, Man and History, Berkovits lays out the reasons for Halacha in general. First of all, Halacha shows that God cares about humanity. We only ask people to do things when we care about them. If we don't care, we don't ask. Second, there is what he calls the indirect method, whereby the Halacha, Jewish law, is a discipline which allows us to train ourselves to do the right thing even in difficult situations. And thirdly, when we perform an action like putting on tefillin, or shaking a lulav, or even praying, when we move our lips, we are using our human bodies to fulfill a sacred purpose. So these are the root reasons why we have a system of Jewish law. But how does it operate in practice? That is his concern in this volume, Not in Heaven. And essentially his argument is as follows, that the purpose of halacha, of Jewish law as it is applied, is to take perfect principles in the Torah and make them workable in everyday life. They have to be workable in a practical sense, they have to be achievable, but also they have to be ethically acceptable. We cannot have a system of Jewish law which performs or enacts ethical barbarisms. And he sees the purpose of Jewish law as applied in the rabbinic process to make sure that Jewish law always fulfills those two criteria. It is practical, it can work on the ground, and also it fulfills ethical imperatives. Now the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law, as opposed to the written law of the 5 books of Moses, is oral precisely because it needs to adapt to different circumstances that arise through history. If there was one law which was set down in black and white and could never change, how could you cope with new innovations? For example, electricity, to give a practical example, or a different role for women in society, to give a more social example. And therefore the oral law in particular, and its oversight by the rabbis, is there to ensure that Jewish law always remains relevant and ethically appropriate to whichever age a Jew happens to be living in. Let me give you a quotation which deals with this point in some detail. Halacha, says Berkovits, is the wisdom of the application of the written word of the Torah to the life and history of the Jewish people. However, this wisdom and its implementation cannot be contained in any book. No written word can deal in advance with the innumerable situations, changes of circumstances, and new developments that normally occur in the history of men and nations. The eternal word of the Torah required a time-related teaching in order to become effective in the life of the Jewish people. This was the tradition passed on by the living word from generation to generation, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Oral Torah, beside the Torah Shebechtav, the written Torah. The need for it has been clearly described by philosophical as well as halachic authorities. Rabbi Joseph Albo, in his Ikarim, Book of Fundamentals, explains it as follows. The Torah could not be complete in such a manner that it could be adequate for all times. New details are continually occurring in the affairs of men, in customs and actions, too many to be included in a book. Therefore, God revealed to Moses orally some general principles, and he briefly alluded to in the written Torah, so that, with their help, the sages in each generation may deduce the new particulars of the law appropriate for the new situation. So that is why we have a living and a vibrant system of Jewish law today, because we could take the principles of the Torah and apply them to contemporary situations through the mechanism of the oral law. Now, this has both a conservative and a radical implication. On the one hand, this is a very fiery defence of Halacha and its eternal application, but also it is saying that we have to be proactive in making sure that Halacha evolves appropriately for the needs of the day. And therefore, Rabbi Berkovits, when he published this book in 1983, was considered on the left of orthodoxy, just as his earlier work in 1959 on theology placed him firmly in the centre of traditional Judaism, which shows that as he got older, he was considered more and more a progressive figure, which is perhaps the opposite way to is often the case with figures as they get older. Thanks for joining.